This morning, we're continuing our series, thinking through the path of wisdom that Bill has set us up for so well, I feel, so far. And this morning, we're going to think about wisdom in the context of the fact that we're on this path. This path is an option, but as Sandra read earlier, it's not the only option, right? There's wisdom, and then there's also folly and foolishness on the other hand, which I feel like is perfect this morning. Because I did not have the wisdom to tell Bill no when he asked me to preach on this passage and on the birthday of my wife and my son's this weekend. So this is, next year, Bill, he's not here right now, but we'll put that in the hopper for next time. But as we think about wisdom this morning, we're going to focus in on these two paths, on these two houses, this house of wisdom on the one hand, and this house of folly, of foolishness on the other. And we're going to focus in and thinking about a little bit, as Sandra asked, where are we feasting? Where is it that we are feasting? Is it at wisdom's house, or is it at foolishness's house? Where are we feasting? And as you might know already from the series or from before, Proverbs gives us an insight into wisdom, right? The whole book is considered wisdom literature. And it was a theme that was very common in the ancient world. Books that were written that were filled with proverbs, with short sayings about how to be wise, what wisdom looked like, what life should look like. And what's interesting is that wisdom throughout the ancient world promised a whole host of different things. Different cultures, different thinkers, different wise people promised something different. And what I think is important for us to see this morning is that while wisdom literature can focus on all sorts of things, right? It all focuses on this idea of flourishing. What does it look like for us to flourish? And in some places, it was, what does it look like for us to flourish when it comes to wealth? Some places, it was, what does it look like for us to flourish when it comes to status and power? Some places, it was, what does it look like for our family to flourish in recognition and importance? But what we see is that God's promise for wisdom is a little bit different than that. That God's promise for wisdom is life. And God's promise for foolishness is death. When we think about the two houses, right, that's what we're offered. That on the one hand, the promise of wisdom is life, and the promise of our foolishness is death. When we walk the path of wisdom, we're walking towards life, right? This life and life to the full that Jesus offers us. When we walk a path towards foolishness, we walk a path towards death. And that doesn't necessarily mean like a literal physical earthly death, an earthly loss of life, but it means death, the not living of this flourishing life. And we saw this, I think, pretty obviously in the two passages that Sandra read earlier, and we'll come back to them in a second. But if you want, you can open up to Proverbs chapter 9. And what we want to see is that Proverbs 9 is the culmination of this first portion of the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs, the first 9 chapters make up a sort of introduction, like a prologue to the rest of the book. And the first 9 chapters set us up with how to think about wisdom, why wisdom's important, so on and so forth. And the rest of the book really gives us wisdom. It gives us, this is what you should do in all sorts of different settings and contexts in your life. And chapter 9 is the changing point there. Chapter 9 is the last moment where the author is saying, here's why wisdom is so important. Here's why this book is so important. And we're going to see there's 3 sections in this chapter, 3 little 6-verse sections that kind of have a parallel sort of structure. And so I'm going to go 6 verses at a time, if you'll bear with me here. But this is what Proverbs 9 says. It says, wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her servants, and she calls from the highest point of the city. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, come, eat my food and drink the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways, and you will live. Walk in the way of insight. The author sets up this picture. He gives us this picture of the house of wisdom, right? And it's a pretty vivid picture, a house with 7 pillars. There's a meal, a feast, and drinks prepared for everyone. The servants of wisdom are out there inviting everyone in. And it's the kind of place that you might want to be at, right? That something fun is happening, something is going on. Even the choice of 7 pillars. Throughout the Bible, we see 7 used as a sort of number to identify completeness, fullness, perfection. So there's 7 pillars here. Like in the book of Revelation, there's 7 letters to 7 churches and 7 seals and 7 trumpets and 7 angels. The idea the author is stating is that wisdom's house is complete. Wisdom's house is full. This is as good as it gets. And wisdom's invitation then is clear. She says, leave your simple ways and you will live. Walk in the way of insight. Leave your simple ways and you will live. Walk in the way of insight. And what's the promise then? The promise is that if we leave our simple ways, if we walk in the way of insight, we'll receive life. That in this wisdom, we'll find life. That's the promise we receive, that wisdom produces life. I don't think that should be a surprise to us necessarily, because Jesus himself connects wisdom to life in all sorts of ways. Jesus told the story about the wise and foolish builders, right? Where the wise man hears his words and puts them into practice, and the foolish man hears his words and doesn't put them into practice. Jesus says wisdom comes from hearing what he has to say and putting them into practice. And in John 14:6, Jesus says, right, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 10:10, Jesus says that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. We have this connection between wisdom that's connected to putting his teachings, putting his words into practice, following him. That wisdom is connected to life and life to the full, the life that he has for us, the life that he's designed for us. Wisdom comes to us with this invitation, with a fully prepared feast. Jesus comes to us with an invitation, follow me, an invitation into this wisdom, and he brings life. And wisdom comes with life. But we have to be willing to accept that invitation first. We have to be willing to accept wisdom's invitation first. You have to be willing to follow Jesus, put Jesus' words into practice. You have to leave your simple ways. You have to walk in the way of insight. And that can be a really tricky thing. That can be a really tricky thing because that requires some real self-reflection about where we're at. That requires us to not just do what feels easiest or think what comes quickest or try to escape all of our discomforts. That requires us to be willing to look at our own lives, and think about what we think, about what we say, about what we do. And honestly ask ourselves the question in the same way that Sandra asked it earlier. Okay, am I feasting at the house of wisdom? Or am I feasting somewhere else? Am I feasting at the house of wisdom, or am I feasting somewhere else? Am I choosing to enter into wisdom's house with the feast that's fully prepared to accept wisdom's invitation, or am I choosing to hold on to something else? Am I choosing to hold on to my simple ways instead? And that's a tough question to answer, in part because none of us want to say we're not feasting at wisdom's house. That's not what we want to admit. But what's nice for us is that the author of the proverb here gives us a pretty clear way of testing which house we're feasting at, of seeing are we feasting at wisdom's house or not. And so we see this in starting in verse 7. It says this. It says, whoever corrects a mocker invites insults. Whoever rebukes the wicked incurs abuse. Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise, and they will love you. Instruct the wise, and they will be wiser still. Teach the righteous, and they will add to their learning. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For through wisdom your days will be many, and years will be added to your life. If you are wise, your wisdom will reward you. If you are a mocker, you alone will suffer. And so there at the end, in verse 11, right, we see this connection again. This connection between the if you are wise, right, days will be added to your life. Time will be added to your life. This connection again, that wisdom produces life. But the first few verses of that section kind of hit on a different topic. They focus on a different sort of thing, right? And I think that there's at least two pretty straightforward ways for us to read this passage. And one of them I think will be more helpful for this morning, and I'm not sure if they're both right or not, but I'm going to share them both. The first is this. It's to see it as a sort of command, okay? Do not correct or rebuke mockers. Right? It's a command. You can see it as a command telling you, do not do this, right? Your Facebook trolls and your Twitter friends, okay? Don't correct them. Your coworker who says all sorts of inane things at work and like blows up when you say something about it, don't correct them. Your family member at Thanksgiving, who when I say that, we all had someone come to mind about who that person is, don't correct them. That's one way to hear the passage, and I'm not sure, that might be accurate. I think there's some truth to that at some level. Jesus himself says, he tells us not to cast our pearls before swine, and I don't really necessarily understand what that means, but it's in this context, it seems to fit together and make sense, that we're not supposed to just kind of give our time and our energy to the correction of these people. I think that's one way to look at it. But this morning, what I want us to do is to use it not to think about how we necessarily act to others, not necessarily in that sort of way, but to think about ourselves and our own response to correction. Because what we see is that the wise person responds to correction how? By growing in their learning and their understanding and in love. They respond with love. The mocker responds with insults and abuse and anger. And what we can do is we can look to our own response. When I'm corrected, how do I respond to people? When you are corrected, how do you respond? How do you respond? It gives us a sense at some level of whether or not we're wise or we're being foolish. Our own response to correction can give us a glimpse of whether or not we're being wise or being foolish. That doesn't mean that every time we're corrected, we just take it at face value and absorb it and change our behaviors. Okay, that's not what it means. But it does mean that how we respond to correction matters. Do we respond with insults and mocking and abuse? Or do we respond with love and growth and understanding? I've got two stories about, I've got plenty of stories in my life about being corrected for all sorts of things. I've got two stories that I'm gonna share this morning about it. And one I think is not flattering and one is more flattering, so we'll see how it goes. But a few years ago, I think it was just before my wife and I got married, we were with a group of friends. And I don't remember what had happened. A situation had happened to a friend of ours, and we were all talking about it. And we talked for a little while, and finally one of our friends stopped, and he said, hey guys, this kind of feels like gossip to me. And in my wisdom and my maturity, I said to him, I said, oh, does this feel like gossip to you? Okay. That didn't go over very well at the 8:30 service, if I'm being honest. That did not. But that was my immediate response, right? Was mockery, was like, oh, come on, like get over yourself. This decision to insult rather than to receive anything. And in hindsight, I can look back on it and say, oh no, I was right, or he was right, I was wrong. Yeah, he was right, I was wrong. That was an opportunity for me to grow in my understanding, to grow in my knowledge, to demonstrate wisdom, and I didn't take it. I chose instead mockery and abuse and insults. A few years after that, Bill sat the staff down in a moment of correction that still stands out to me. I'd just been on staff for about a year at this point. And every Tuesday, most Tuesdays, we have a staff meeting together, and we sit at tables, and someone brings donuts or something, and it's nice. But this Tuesday, a few years ago, there's just a circle of chairs and there's no tables and there's no donuts. And I thought, something's happened. And Bill sat us down, and very gently and very kindly, he said, I'm a little frustrated. He said, because as a staff, we ask people to be generous with their money all the time. We ask people during offering moments to be generous with their money. We ask people during our Christmas and Easter offerings to be generous with our money. We preach about being generous with our money. And yet, he said, some of us on staff aren't being generous with our money, especially not to what God has for us, God is doing here at Beachpoint. And that stunned for me because I knew the moment he said it, I hoped he wasn't just talking about me, but I knew he was talking about me. Ryan and I had just gotten married. We felt like we didn't really have a lot of money. We kind of gave out of our excess every once in a while, not really thinking about what it looked like to give all the time. And in that moment when he said that, my first response, right, was that same anger and frustration and the emotion, the want to act out in mockery and insults and abuse. But in that moment, I realized, no, Bill is wise. He's offering me wisdom. This is good correction for my life. This is an opportunity for me to grow. And if I choose the other direction, if I just said to Bill in that staff meeting, oh, we're not being generous, right? Like, probably get fired. But I wouldn't have grown. It wouldn't have been an opportunity for me to experience a fuller life, to experience this growth. And I think for all of us, how we respond to correction matters. It's important for us to think about how we respond to correction. There's an economist, his name was John Kenneth Galbraith, and he said this. He said, faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving that there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof. And I would say, I would honestly be surprised if there's someone in here who over the past year, the past month, maybe even the past week, hasn't been corrected in some way, and our first response was not to pull out our phone and Google the proof we needed to not change our minds. That's just the reality of the world we live in right now. And yet what we know is that how we respond to correction matters. That insults, abuse, mockery, Google, they can't provide us with life. Okay, they don't produce life for us. Wisdom is what produces life. It's Jesus that produces life in us. That if we're going to be people who want life and life to the full that Jesus offers us, then we're going to have to be people who respond well to correction, who respond well to people saying, hey, this is not what God has for you. And in verse 10, we get to see that the beginning of wisdom, right, it says is fear of the Lord and knowledge of the Holy One, right? The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord and knowledge of the Holy One. That knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Wisdom starts with understanding who God is and how you relate to God. Wisdom starts there. It starts by understanding or trying to understand who God is in his infinite love, his infinite knowledge, his infinite wisdom, and trying to understand how we relate to him, how we relate to God. It starts with us understanding God and his greatness. And in light of his greatness and who he is, trying to understand our sense of wisdom. And the reality is we're never going to understand perfectly, I don't think, who God is. All the attributes of his character, everything about him until maybe the day when Jesus comes again, right? We are finite beings trying to understand an infinite God as best we can. But wisdom starts with us understanding our relationship to him. And it reminds us that compared to him, we don't know all that much to begin with. There's a story about the philosopher Socrates that I think is relevant, and Bill asked the son of a philosopher to preach on wisdom. And so we're going to get 2 philosophical references, and this is the first. So there's a story about Socrates, and the way the story goes is that Socrates' friend goes to the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle at Delphi was this priestess. She was a prophet at the time. And the oracle would make prophecies about the way the world was. She would make true statements about the way the world was and the near future, how things would go. Pretty famously, in high school, almost everyone reads Oedipus Rex in high school, and it's starring for a whole host of reasons. But in Oedipus Rex, the oracle makes a prophecy, right? That Oedipus will, if you know what an Oedipus complex is, do all these terrible things. And if you don't, then you can Google it for proof afterwards. But the way that it goes is that the oracle in Socrates' case, the oracle says that Socrates is the wisest man in the world. And Socrates takes offense to this because he says, there are many wiser people than me. There are many people who know more than I do about all sorts of things. And so he goes off on this journey to try to figure out who could be wiser than he is. And he visits all these different people. And at the very end, what's discovered is the oracle says this. They say, one of you, O human beings, is wisest, who like Socrates has become cognizant that in truth, he is worth nothing in respect to wisdom. Right? Socrates was the wisest person in the world because he realized that in truth, he was worth nothing when it came to wisdom. He was the one who was humble enough to recognize he really didn't know everything. And it's what made him wisest. And in the same sort of way, I think what we can see is that fear of the Lord and knowledge of the Holy One produces the same sort of wisdom in us. It produces the sort of wisdom that recognizes that I actually am not that wise. I don't know that much. In comparison to God and his infinite goodness and his infinite knowledge and his infinite wisdom, I am nothing. I don't know what I'm talking about. And when we have a proper understanding of who God is, of his greatness, of his love, of his infinite wisdom, a proper understanding of how we relate to him, that's when we start to become wise. When we understand that we're not beyond correction, that we're not so knowledgeable about anything that there isn't someone who can come alongside and say, hey, you've missed it. And here's why this is also important is because, as Sandra read, wisdom's house isn't the only option. Right? Wisdom's house isn't the only option available to us. And the other option is not a good option. In verse 13, it says, Folly is an unruly woman. She is simple and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple come to my house. To those who have no sense, she says, stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious. But little do they know that the dead are there, that her guests are deep in the realm of the dead. There's this second house, right? Who knows how far it is from wisdom's house, but this is Folly's house. And Folly's house is the opposite of wisdom's in so many ways. But what we see is that foolishness is still there inviting us in. Inviting us in, and what we see at the end is that foolishness produces death. That the result, the end of foolishness is death. It's being among the realm of the dead, right? Folly invites everyone in, but unlike wisdom's feast, nothing is prepared in advance. There's stolen water and food that has to be eaten in secret. It's not a good offer, but the simple still come to the table. They still come to Folly's house. In part because Folly's invitation doesn't require you to grow or to develop or change. It doesn't require you to leave your simple ways. Her invitation says, come as you are and stay as you are. Folly's invitation doesn't bring correction. It doesn't bring correction because folly already has you where she needs you to be. Folly gives you reassuring words that make you feel better about where you're at. Folly offers up whatever confirms that you are right, whatever lets you avoid that moment of self-reflection because she already has you where she wants you. Right? She already has you among the dead. And I wish sometimes that there was an easy way to squirm out of that picture at the end. To squirm out of the picture of sitting there and being at the realm of the dead and not even knowing it. Of being totally unaware. Because when you really start to think about it and start to wonder, you have to start to wonder whether or not you're feasting at Folly's house. Whether or not you're feasting on foolishness and you're surrounded by the dead, you're surrounded in the realm of the dead, and you just haven't realized it yet. We have to ask ourselves the question, okay, whose house am I feasting at? Genuinely, whose house am I feasting at? Am I feasting at wisdom's house, or am I feasting at folly's house? Have I accepted an easy invitation that doesn't require change? Have I chosen food that must be eaten in secret for whatever reason? Have I allowed myself to be oblivious to the death that surrounds me? Am I feasting at folly's house or at wisdom's house? And part of the challenge here is that we are exceptionally good at convincing ourselves when we ask ourselves this question that we are feasting at wisdom's house. Right? We are very good at that. That's part of what it means to be human, is to be very good at convincing yourself of these things. We're very good at convincing ourselves that we are putting Jesus' words into practice. We're very good at convincing ourselves that we find ourselves feasting at wisdom's table. And in part, this is why correction is so important. This is why our response to correction is so important, because we need people in our lives who can look at us and say, hey, this is not wise. This is not bringing you life. That doesn't line up with what Jesus has for you. Who can look at our situations and say, you are surrounded by the dead. You are living in the realm of the dead and you don't even realize it yet. And so if we ask ourselves whose house we're feasting at, we're also going to have to be willing to ask our friends whose house we're feasting at. To maybe ask our pastors whose house we're feasting at, to ask the Spirit whose house we're feasting at. And then if they respond and they say, hey, you're feasting at the house of foolishness, we're gonna have to figure out what it looks like to accept wisdom's invitation instead. And for me this morning, if I'm being honest, part of the struggle of getting ready for this sermon is that I had a hard time being very confident that we would respond to that correction. Like I said, we're really good at convincing ourselves that we don't need to change. It's something that as humans, we're just exceptionally good at. What we know from all sorts of studies, some psychological, sociological, economical, political studies, is that in general, when people are corrected, their first response is something called entrenchment. And it's to dig your heels in, right? To dig in and defend yourself the moment someone says something wrong. And you can feel it. If someone came up to you and said, hey, you're doing your job wrong that you've done for who knows how long, my guess is like your first response is, who are you to say to me that I'm doing it wrong? To dig in, to stand your ground, to hold on to what you've been told, to what you believe. And we're really good at it. And I'm sorry if I'm just preaching to myself here, and I apologize for that, and then you're just along for this element with me here. But one thing I was struck by was there's a sort of fatalism to it, that this idea that really we won't change. Maybe we believe we ourselves will change, but we don't think other people will change. And I was struck by that the story that we see out of Proverbs seems to tell us to give up on that idea, to embrace the idea, the reality that it is possible for us to change. It is possible for us to receive correction, to hear correction, and make real change, to step into the house of wisdom, to leave the house of folly behind. But it requires quite a bit of work. Plato told this story. This is the second philosophy reference. So Plato told this story that's pretty famous. It's known as the allegory of the cave. And if you might be familiar with the story, or you might be familiar with the movie The Matrix, which is more or less the same thing. And the way the story goes, as Plato tells it, is that there's a cave, and there's people who live in the cave, not by choice, but they're chained up there in the cave. And they spend their whole lives, they're chained up, staring at a wall in front of them, the wall of the cave. And behind them are another group of people, not chained up, and a large fire. And the people behind them put on these elaborate puppet shows in front of the fire, and they cast shadows on the wall of the cave. And the people that are chained up there spend their whole lives watching this puppet show. And they know no better. All they know is this life. All they know is these things in front of them, these shapes, these forms in front of them. And that's what they think life is. And if that's not a picture of what it looks like to live in the realm of the dead, then I don't know what is. But Plato says that by chance in his story, someone breaks free of their chains. The chains fall off, something happens, and one man goes up and he goes to the surface. He escapes away. He sees the sun in all of its wonder. He sees the trees in all of their splendor. He sees real wildlife in all of its amazing different ways. And he sees life and life to the full in that moment. He gets a glimpse of the fullness of life that he's been missing out on before. And his obligation, he realizes, is to go back in the cave, to go get the people he left behind and say, hey, you're missing out. There's so much more to this than shadows on a wall in front of us. And here's the thing that I love about the Christian story that's better than all the thinkers and philosophers and people before it. Here's the beauty of the story, is that Plato said someone had to do that by chance. But what we know is that it's not chance. It's that Jesus himself did that for us. That he was willing, in all of his fullness and his goodness and his experience with life and life to the full, to enter into the cave, to go to the house of folly for us and invite us to life, to invite us out, to free us from these chains, to say, leave behind your simple ways and come with me. Come experience life and life to the full. Right, the Apostle Paul puts the invitation this way. He says to the people in Ephesians, he says, wake up, O sleepers, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. The invitation is to wake up, to rise from the dead, to leave the realm of the dead behind, and to find this life that he has for you. To experience the wisdom that he has for you. And so this morning, we're gonna continue in a time of worship in a second. But as we do, I wanna invite you to think about the question again. Where am I feasting? Where am I feasting? That might be a hard question to answer in 2 minutes between this moment and the next. But I want to invite you maybe even to be bold enough to take the time in prayer to not just ask yourself, but to ask Jesus, say, Jesus, where am I feasting? What am I feasting on right now? To allow him to reveal to you as the one who enters into the cave to free you from the chains, who goes into the house of folly to bring you out into life and life to the full, to say, Jesus, where am I feasting? Am I feasting on wisdom, or am I feasting on folly? And maybe even to ask this, you could ask Jesus, if you're open to the correction, you could say, Jesus, who could help me see if I'm feasting on wisdom and or folly? Who in my life is there that I could ask and say, hey, have I given up on the house of wisdom and embraced the house of folly? Where am I feasting right now? So I want to invite you to just take a moment and we'll continue in worship together.